Welcome to chapter 3. Sorry about the breaks between the chapters. It seems I'm doing one night off in between. That might change. I don't know. I try to keep it fairly consistent, but life, you know. So here's chapter 3. Harry gaped at Dumbledore, unable to say a thing. Seeing Dumbledore standing beside his bed in his small bedroom at the Dursleys was completely surreal. Dumbledore sighed and flicked his wand, pulling the necklace and amulet away from Harry's body. "Sir," Harry managed to say, swallowing a few times against his dry throat. He pushed himself up and emptied his mind, pushing his incriminating thoughts away to the back and securing it behind his mental walls. I'm using a few language amulets, sir. That's hardly illegal, isn't it? That's legal, isn't it? If there were only language amulets, then yes, it would be legal, Dumbledore said, looking down at Harry over the rim of his spectacles with a rather knowing look. But I have been on good authority you've been using these amulets for far more than languages. Frowning, Harry chewed his lip. Who would have betrayed him? Draco was the only one that knew for sure about the amulet, that Harry was using the amulets, and Harry was absolutely sure that Draco would never rat on him, at least not voluntarily. It's a very good thing indeed that Mr. Malfoy has such caring parents. Dumbledore said, taking a step back and gesturing Harry out of bed. They saw right through his son's excuse and ordered one of the house elves to search his belongings. Ah, yeah, that explained it then. Harry realised the jig was up and released a sigh and swung his legs over the bed, rubbing his hands across his face. We've been very careful with the amulets, sir. We're only using them to learn useful things. I've been staying away from any bad magic. Harry he'd come across while he'd been breaking into the restricted section of the library. He hadn't bothered with it in the end. There was still so much magic to learn that wasn't dark at all. And I'm glad to hear you've at least been responsible in that way, but nonetheless, using these amulets come with grave consequences, Dumbledore said in a firm but kind voice. Noise came from downstairs. Aunt Petunia was ranting about something. Then footsteps ascended the stairs, and Snape appeared in the doorway of Harry's bedroom, Harry's trunk floating behind him. Harry blinked at the sight of his most hated professor sneering at him. If it was weird seeing Dumbledore standing in the Dursleys' house, seeing Snape there was 100 times more bizarre. "Ah, I see you found Mr. Potter's trunk," Dumbledore said with a pleasant smile as he gave Snape a nod. "You may return to Hogwarts. I'll be along shortly with the rest of Harry's possessions." Wait, what? Harry stood up as Snape disappeared down the stairs again. "I'm going to Hogwarts? Why?" "To monitor while you recover, to make sure you stop using the amulets." Dumbledore took a few steps back and gave Harry's room a critical once over. "Where are your belongings, Harry?" Harry didn't want to give Dumbledore the stash of amulets that he and Draco worked so hard on, but he didn't see any way to stop the headmaster either. Harry supposed he could play along and pretend to want to quit while using the amulets. Then once people left him, he could make more. Sinking to his knees, Harry reached under the bed, pulled back a loose floorboard, and pulled his backpack out and stood up. "They're all in here." "Thank you," Dumbledore said, grasping the bag and pulling it away from Harry. "Now, hold on, and I'll apparate us to Hogwarts." Dumbledore placed a hand on Harry's shoulder, and the next thing Harry knew was being squeezed through a very tight tube, and he suddenly found himself in the hospital wing at Hogwarts. Draco was sitting on top of the bed in black silk pyjamas and looking very put out. Beside him was Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy, who immediately gave Harry glares and made it clear how much they despised him. "Headmaster Dumbledore," Mrs. Malfoy said, her voice soft but full of spite. "Mr. Potter ought to be expelled for what he's done to our son, forcing him to use those amulets." Harry gaped at her as Dumbledore gave him a gentle push to a nearby bed. "Mother!" Draco sat up in outrage as he gave his mother a disbelieving look. Harry did not force me. I approached him and blackmailed him until he gave me some." Dumbledore politely ignored the rather unfortunate confession. Mrs. Malfoy looked down at Harry with a wrinkle of her nose, as though she was smelling something foul. Mr. Malfoy didn't know if he should be angry or proud of his son for successfully blackmailing someone. "The punishment of Mr. Potter and Mr. Malfoy shall be determined at a later date," Dumbledore said, clapping his hands in front of his blue robes and giving the Malfoys a pleasant smile. For now, I do believe we should focus on their immediate recovery. Madame Pomfrey can monitor them for the coming weeks and can minister them of potions they may need. After that, Draco will be released back into your care as long as you keep his wand away from him for the rest of the summer, and Harry will be released back into his godfather's care, since they both need close monitoring for the coming weeks." Harry's mind was reeling as he climbed on top of the bed. Now Dumbledore was willing to let Sirius have custody of Harry for the rest of the summer, while before he insisted Harry return to the Dursleys. "Severus should have returned to his office by now," Dumbledore said with a nod towards the door. "I'm sure he'll want to discuss things with you. In the meantime, I'd like to speak to the boys in private." Mr. and Mrs. Malfoy said goodbye to their son, Mrs. Malfoy stroking a loving hand over his hair and down his cheek. Draco made a face as though he'd abhorred that kind of affection, but Harry noticed him leaning into his mother's touch anyway. The Malfoys disappeared through the door. Dumbledore conjured an armchair for himself between Harry and Draco's beds. "I'm sure you're wondering what the big deal about using the amulets are." Harry shrugged while Draco sniffed, sticking his nose in the air. "Mother said they rot your brains, but we've been using them for months now, and our brains are fine, right, Harry?" "Yeah," Harry agreed quickly. "I mean, using 4 at once gave me a nosebleed, and 3 left me a bit tired, but using 1 or 2 never gave me any problems." Dumbledore looked positively alarmed by hearing what Harry was saying, but took a moment to compose himself before continuing. "The reason these amulets are not illegal for learning languages is because magically adding foreign words and new grammar to the brain requires very little physical changes." "Physical changes?" Draco asked, grey eyes widening as he stared at Dumbledore with suspicion. Dumbledore nodded, folding his hands in his lap, using the amulets to add knowledge other than languages alters your brain forever. New channels are made in which information travels in a way that your brain becomes more in many ways the brain becomes more intelligent. Harry raised an eyebrow at hearing that. So using the amulets hadn't just made him more knowledgeable, they had also made him smarter in general. "Yes, that still does sound like a positive thing, doesn't it?" Draco said while giving Harry a knowing smile. "But those are not the only changes that occur. It may be a way for new channels in your to make way for the new channels in your brain. The brain must lose certain areas that help regulate human emotion." Harry did not like the sound of that, and by the pinched look on Draco's face, Neither did he. Using the amulets changes your mind and makes you less empathetic. Maybe it makes them more paranoid and eventually use access to any more positive emotions. Dumbledore nodded as he noticed the shock on Harry and Draco's face. It changes a person in a way that they lose the ability to care for others in the long run. I didn't know that, Harry whispered, a cold shiver running down his back. He truly didn't realize his whole personality was changing, but looking at the year, he recognized that he acted differently in the past year. He had been less concerned with Ron and Hermione's feelings. He had been able to shrug off things which would have upset him in the past. He had been able to keep secrets from even his closest friend without a second thought. There are others who aim to gain unlimited knowledge through the amulets. Some of them you have heard, and some you met personally. Who? Draco asked, sounding like he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Gilbert Grindelwald, Dumbledore said softly. Lord Voldemort. Harry inhaled a sharp breath, his whole body now so cold he wondered if someone had cast a freezing spell on him. Bellatrix Lestrange, Dumbledore added, with a pointed glance at Draco, who looked a bit green. Draco had told him all about his crazy aunt who was locked up in Azkaban. And myself, Dumbledore said finally, much to Harry's surprise. Dumbledore held up a hand when it became apparent that both Harry and Draco wanted to ask questions. I was a foolish young man who had met a charming young man who was a user of learning amulets. He convinced me to start using them as well. Right after I'd finished Hogwarts, I saw no harm in giving it a try, and feeling no negative consequences. Harry swallowed and stared at his legs. That sounded all too familiar. But without me even knowing, they changed me. I stopped paying as much attention to my family as I should. I stopped caring about certain people. I stopped looking after them as much as I'd always done. It resulted in a tragedy and the death of a loved one, which snapped me out of my complacency. Dumbledore's face grew paler. His eyes stared distant at a ledge window. A dear friend of mine who I'd been ignoring helped me stop using the amulets for good. What about Voldemort? Harry asked, voice barely more than a whisper. I thought he was always smart. But it was all just the amulets? Voldemort was an exceptionally gifted student before he discovered the amulets. I believe he started using them in second year, and he was able to keep using them through his whole Hogwarts career. Dumbledore ran a hand down his face. Eventually his head of house discovered them and urged Voldemort to stop using them on the pain of losing his head boy badge, which I believe Voldemort did, at least for a while. But later on, Voldemort urged many of his followers to use the amulets to help them quickly learn the dark arts, like my Aunt Bellatrix. Draco mumbled, gaze fixed on the window at the other side of the infirmary. That's why she became so unstable. Harry felt like crying suddenly. He'd never known any of this. He never even realized those stupid amulets can change you in such a painful and dramatic way. He swallowed a painful lump in his throat. It's one of the reasons I started using them, he whispered, horrified in ways he'd never felt before, because I'd encountered Voldemort twice before, and having all the magical knowledge to help me survive the third encounter. Oh, Harry, Dumbledore said, voice full of great sorrow, if you keep using these amulets, you won't defeat Lord Voldemort. You'll become Lord Voldemort. A sob escaped Harry's throat before he could stop it, his shoulders shaking as he wrapped his arms around himself. At once, Draco flew off his bed and clambered on top of Harry's to pull him into a tight hug. "I had no idea," Harry whispered in between tight sobs. He really did not want to cry in front of Dumbledore or Draco, but he couldn't stop himself. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." "Me neither," Draco said, his own voice cracking. "I thought Mother was simply exaggerating when she warned me about them." For a long moment, Harry clung to Draco with all his might, and Draco clung back. Dumbledore seemed surprised to see both boys displaying their emotions like this. Eventually, Harry wondered if this was some sort of evidence that they hadn't accidentally turned themselves into unfeeling monsters just yet. "Harry, I must ask where you learned about the amulets," Dumbledore said eventually, when Harry and Draco had calmed down a bit and let go of each other. Draco stayed put beside Harry's bed, one hand remaining protectively on Harry's thigh. "Diagonally," Harry said, pulling his glasses off and running a trembling hand across his face. He hated betraying anyone, but he figured the clerk who had talked to him didn't know the horrible consequences. In Madame Celeste's, there was a clerk named Julian Colton who told me about the amulets and sent me to random regulars in Nocturne Alley. He was a 7th year Hufflepuff when I was in 1st year. Draco snorted and gave Harry a disbelieving look. "Julian Colton was a 7th year Slytherin when we were in 1st year." Squeezing his eyes shut, Draco shook his head. "Oh, that utter pillock. This makes so much sense." What makes sense?" Harry said, asked in alarm. He had been completely clueless about Julian Colton so far, apparently. "At the end of our 1st year, when Dumbledore stole the house cup from us by giving you a lot of points at the last moment, Colton ranted about it for the rest of the evening. He was really pissed off because he was a good student who got a lot of house points." Draco shook his head and gave Harry an almost pitying look. "He must have been delighted when he saw you walking into his store, saw an opportunity for a little revenge. So he knew about the side effects of the amulets." Harry asked, outrage brewing in his belly, setting fire to his inside. "He told me to use as many as I wanted, to just try them out." Draco snorted. "Of course he knew about the effects. Colton's been working his family store for years. He grew up learning this sort of stuff." "I shall pay Mr. Colton a visit," Dumbledore said, while he pushed himself up from his chair. "I shall tell Amelia Bones. Let Amelia Bones know that her auras should. I shall let Amelia Bones know that her auras should pay a visit to random regulars." Regalias? He vanished the armchair and gave Harry and Draco a nod. "Try and get some rest. The coming nights will be tough, but do remember it will get better." "Can we be healed?" Harry asked, licking his brain. "Damage to our brains." "I'm afraid not," Dumbledore said with a shake of his head as he walked around Harry's bed towards the doors. "But as long as you never use them again, the damage should be minimal at this stage. I will search your belongings, Harry. Have a house elf deliver them to you as soon as possible." And with that, Dumbledore swept from the hospital wing, leaving Harry and Draco alone. "I'm so sorry," Harry said, lips trembling as he stared at Draco. "I feel like this is all my fault." "Don't be absurd," Draco said at once with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I came to you, threatened you to make me those amulets. I really don't want to turn into Voldemort." Harry said, his insides full of despair at the mere thought. Yes, and I really don't want to turn into my dear Aunt Bella. Draco agreed, with a shudder as he gave Harry a miserable look. Still, I'm glad I got to know you, though, Harry added quickly, lest Draco think Harry didn't like him anymore. That was the best part about all this mess. Draco's smile was as bright as the sun and made Harry a little less worried that he'd somehow lose Draco now they no longer had the amulets to bind them together. I really don't want to use them anymore, Harry mumbled, much to himself as Draco. He had been full on the plans how to sneak around Dumbledore and every other adult in his life to keep using the amulets, but now he knew the horrible truth, and Harry knew it simply wasn't worth it. Me either, Draco said feverishly. Sorry. Fervently. Shook his head, but as long as no real harm was done, I suppose we should look at positive results instead of focusing on the negative consequences. Draco raised an eyebrow and gave Harry a cheeky grin. We're animagi at 13 and we can pass our newts in our sleep. Then you should both register at the ministry at your earliest opportunity, Madame Pomfrey said as he came in, as she came out of her office. Harry had almost forgotten about her. Of course, Madame Pomfrey. We're planning to do so at our earliest convenience. Harry nodded with a laugh, snorted with laughter at the disbelieving look on Pomfrey's face. Well, we will now, at any rate. Draco stuck out his bottom lip with a prudent pout. Bugger! Harry wanted to kiss him so badly, but Pomfrey came bustling over with 2 breakfast trays floating behind her. She handed them over without comment, and Harry and Draco sat side by side and enjoyed their meals in peace and quiet, still letting everything that happened sink in. Plinky went through my things after Mother broke my anti-elf wards, Draco said as they were done with breakfast. The moment she found the amulets, she alerted Mother and Father. I suppose I should be grateful for that in hindsight. Mother called Snape, and he told me that the amulets caused permanent damage, so I had no choice but to tell them about you. I didn't want you to get hurt. Draco gave Harry a pleading look, clearly willing him to understand. Yeah, I get that, Harry said, bumping his shoulder against Draco. I woke up to Dumbledore standing over my bed. I didn't know what to think, except maybe that I was dreaming. Draco threw his head back and laughed. I really want to kiss you, Harry blurted, because he simply couldn't stop thinking about that. I mean, if you still want to do that with me. Cheeks flushing just a bit, Draco appeared as though he didn't have a care in the world. He gave a half shrug and looked at Harry with a lopsided grin. Yeah, I wouldn't stop you. I would. But I would, Madame Pomfrey said with an exasperated sigh as she came over to take the empty trays. This time, there is time and a place for that kind of thing, gentlemen, but the hospital wing is not it. Harry and Draco collapsed in nervous snickers as Madame Pomfrey walked away. Not long, Jesus, lost my place for a second. Madame Pomfrey walked away not long after the doors opened and Mr. and Mrs. Weasley returned. Harry moved back to his own bed under the watchful and clearly disapproving gaze of his parents, much to Harry's surprise when the door opened again. Sirius Black and Remus Lupin walked in. Harry had only met Sirius twice, and both meetings were brief. Sorry. Harry had only met Sirius twice, and both were brief meetings in Dumbledore's office as they hashed out their summer arrangement. "Cousin?" Sirius said with a little cool nod he gave at Mrs. Malfoy, who simply nodded back just as stiffly. Then Sirius gave Harry a wide grin. "Heard you got into some trouble." Wouldn't be a Potter if you didn't." "Hi," Harry said, beaming up at his godfather, glad that Sirius didn't seem too angry. Lupin pulled a couple of chairs over and sat down next to Harry's bedside. "At least you're not a legal animagus at 15 like some people I know," Lupin said with a warm and fond look at Sirius. "No, they're a legal animagus at 13. Madame Pomfrey called from her office, and they should register." Sirius blinked in shock at the look as he looked Harry up and down. "Are you really? Show us." Shrugging, Harry sat up a little and concentrated his magic. He didn't need a wand to transform. He'd done it so often, by now it came naturally. A few moments later, he was a raven who flapped his wings a few times. "Are you seeing this, Moony? An animagus at 13. Sirius looked as though he was about to burst with pride. On the other hand, Draco concentrated for a moment and transformed into a falcon, much to his parents' surprise. "That is very impressive magic," Mr. Malfoy said, looking just as proud as Sirius, though he hid it better. Even Mrs. Malfoy seemed pleased, though she barely showed it. Harry couldn't resist and flew over to Draco's bed, hitting Draco with a large wing and taking off into the air. Before long, both birds were sailing around the hospital ring, chasing each other in an aerial version of tag. No, absolutely no flying in the hospital wing." Madame Pomfrey stood with her hands at her sides, glaring at both birds. "Back to bed for both of you." With some reluctance, Harry and Draco returned to their bed and transformed back. Harry chatted with Sirius and Lupin for a bit about the whole animagus process and a few other things he learned over the past year. Sirius really didn't seem to hold it against Harry what he'd done. While Sirius was openly disapproving of using the amulets, he couldn't blame Harry for biting off more than he could chew on his quest to become a better wizard. "Dumbledore said they'll be staying with you for the rest of the summer," Harry said, to which Sirius nodded at once. "But what about the wards at the Dursleys?" Sirius shrugged. "They're full, but Dumbledore thought it more important that you have constant adult supervision for this summer to make sure you quit using the amulets than to keep those wards charged." Harry nodded, and while he didn't try to show it, he still felt deeply satisfied with this result. Really, using those amulets for almost a year, while they addled his brain, was worth it if he meant if he never had to go back to the Dursleys. Through the day, Madame Pomfrey gave Harry and Draco a few small sips of draught of peace to keep their minds relaxed for the coming night. Right before bedtime, she gave them both dreamless sleep. The next morning, Harry woke up with a small headache and was feeling a bit irritable. Draco seemed to be doing similarly. Sirius and Lupin returned, who insisted on being called Remus since he was no longer a professor. Harry's possessions were returned to him, and they were allowed to get dressed after a shower. Sirius took Harry and Draco outside to burn off some of the energy. They borrowed school brooms, the two had a game of Quidditch with just one quaffle. Harry and Draco won, which wasn't a surprise. Sirius hadn't flown in decades, and Remus was never much of a Quidditch player. They were given another dreamless sleep, which again made sure they got some rest. The next morning, the headache was much worse, but thankfully, Pomfrey gave them some painkillers, which took most of the pain away until just a vague pounding remained in Harry's head. Sirius and Remus took both of them on a visit to Hogsmeade, where they had lunch at the Three Broomsticks. Harry noticed that he wasn't able to put up with much of anything, and even ended up snarling at Draco for no reason. Draco snarled right back, feeling just as miserable as Harry did. Pomfrey gave them an extra dose of draught of peace that afternoon, and that evening came around. But when the evening came around, she had no dreamless sleep for them. It's time for your minds to learn how to sleep on their own again. Yeah, that was easier said than done. Both Harry and Draco tossed and turned for the night and only managed to doze for an hour or two. There were no visitors the next morning, which was a very good thing because they both felt like absolute crap. Ugh, Harry groaned, laying on his side as he stared at Draco on the other bed. How long will this last? Too long, Draco mumbled. His face pinched tightly, eyes squeezed shut. How can it be this bad? All we did was learn some magic, for fuck's sake. The draught of peace brought some relief, but not enough that they didn't spend the whole day lounging in bed feeling miserable, complaining the whole time. Harry managed some sleep that night, but kept waking up in cold sweats, mind in turmoil. Would it be really such a bad thing to use one of the amulets again, just to help in sleep? But then Harry remembered Dumbledore's wording about how he had become Voldemort, and Harry really, really didn't want that to happen. So he sighed and turned to the other side and tried desperately to sleep. Both Harry and Draco had dark circles around their eyes the next morning, but they had slept a few hours, so that was promising. Draco's parents stopped by for barely an hour, but they brought a whole array of magical games with them, so Harry and Draco kept themselves busy that day playing board games and chess and gobstones. By the end of the week, Harry still felt somewhat miserable, but he didn't need any more potions, so he was ready to leave the infirmary. Mrs. Malfoy arrived first to collect Draco. "All right," Draco said as he gathered his provisions. "We can figure out where to meet for the Quidditch World Cup." Dumbledore arrived moments later with Sirius in tow. This is still a matter of punishment for the boys to consider," Draco said, while Sirius looked positively apologetic, much to Harry's alarm. "It's been declared that Harry and Draco will not attend the Quidditch World Cup, and they'll serve some detention in their 4th year." "What?" Draco cried, looking around at the adults in outrage. "That's not fair!" Mrs. Malfoy looked very close to losing her cool. "What's not fair is you disobeying me, Draco. You will be punished for your actions. End of story." Draco, somewhat subdued, but sulked for the rest of the time as he got his stuff together and followed his mother out of the infirmary. He gave Harry one bright smile and promised to see him again soon as possible. Sirius shrank all of Harry's belongings, which were packed in his trunk and book bag. "Come on, let's go. Remus are waiting at home with Ron and Hermione. You owe them an explanation as well, I believe." Harry almost tripped over his own feet. Fucking hell. He had no idea what he was going to say to his best friends about this whole mess. Right, so that was the end of chapter 3. I hope you enjoyed. A little bit short last time, but I hope it was good all the same. The link will be once again in the description. Requests for ships are always welcome. Though if if I don't know the ship in itself, there's not a certainty that I'll do it, but I might give it a try, depending on circumstances, you know? If I have the time to research into it. So thank you very much for reading. I'll try and come back with chapter 4 as soon as possible. And see you soon, I suppose.